A kind mechanic rescued 12 stranded riders. The thank you they planned left him speechless. The belt snapped at 2:47 in the afternoon, and Eddie Larson knew before the sound even finished echoing off the asphalt that the day had just turned into something much worse. He pulled his bike to the shoulder and killed the engine. The smell hit him first. Hot rubber and something almost sweet underneath it, like burning oil mixed with dry summer air. He had been riding for 31 years, and he knew that smell the way a doctor knows the sound of a bad cough. It was not a smell that came with good news. Behind him, the group began to break. One by one, the engines quieted and the bikes rolled to a stop, spreading across the gravel shoulder like a scattered hand of cards. 12 of them. 12 bikes, 12 riders, 12 people who had been laughing 40 minutes ago at a diner 3 towns back, arguing about who had ordered the wrong thing and whose coffee had gone cold before it reached the table. Now nobody was laughing. Kenny Briggs pulled up beside Eddie and cut his engine. He was a wide man with a white beard that he kept trimmed short, and he had a way of looking at a problem without saying anything for a long moment before he decided what he thought about it. He looked at Eddie's bike. He looked at the smoke curling off the rear end. He looked at Eddie. "Belt," Eddie said. Kenny nodded, heard it from 4 bikes back. The rest of the group gathered on the shoulder. 12 people standing in the heat of an August afternoon on a state highway in rural Tennessee, 43 miles from the nearest town with a real mechanic's shop. The sky was white with heat. The road ahead was flat and empty. On either side of the highway there was nothing but fields, pale gold and completely still, stretching all the way to the tree line. Pete Calloway walked up from the back of the group, pulling off his gloves. He was 64 years old, the oldest rider in the group, and he moved with the careful economy of a man whose knees had opinions about how fast he walked. He crouched down beside Eddie's bike and looked at the belt without touching anything. Then he stood up and looked down the road in both directions, as if an answer might be coming from one of them. "What have we got on the other bikes?" he asked. They checked. The news was not good. 2 more bikes had been running rough since the last fuel stop. Gary Sutton's rear tire had a slow leak he had been meaning to address for 2 weeks and had not addressed. Lynn Hargrove's clutch cable was fraying in a spot that had been fine that morning and was now, under the sustained heat of the ride, looking like it had opinions of its own. It was not a single disaster. It was a slow accumulation of small ones, all arriving at the same time in the same place in the middle of nowhere. Pete pulled out his phone. 1 bar. He looked at it for a second, then walked back and forth along the shoulder trying to find a second bar. He found half of one. "Anyone else?" he said. 4 people held up their phones. One had 2 bars. That was Linda Cole, who always had better signal than everyone else because she had switched carriers 2 years ago after a similar situation in Wyoming and had never let them forget it. "I have 2, she said, not gloating, just stating it. She was already scrolling. They needed a mechanic who would come to them. Not a tow service. Not someone who would haul the bikes to a lot and leave 12 people in the middle of August heat waiting for a rental van that would take 3 hours to arrive. They needed someone who would load up tools and parts and drive out to a highway shoulder and work. That was a specific kind of person. Not every mechanic was that kind of person. Linda found a number on a faded listing that hadn't been updated in what looked like several years. The shop was called Darby's. The listing had no website, no photos, no reviews from the last 18 months, just a phone number and an address and 3 words under the business name: Bikes, all makes. She showed Pete. He looked at it. "Call it," he said. She pressed the number with 1 bar left on her phone, stepped to the edge of the shoulder where the gravel met the dry grass, and held her breath. It rang 4 times, then a man picked up. His voice was unhurried, not slow in the way of someone uninterested, but slow in the way of someone who did not believe in wasting words on speed when steadiness worked better. He said the name of the shop. He said hello. Linda told him where they were. She told him how many bikes. She told him about the belt, the clutch cable, the tire, the rough engines. She did not soften any of it. There was a pause on his end, not a long one, maybe 3 seconds. "What highway?" he said. She told him. "What mile marker?" She looked, walked 20 feet to find the green sign half buried in tall grass at the edge of the shoulder. 71, she said. Another pause. "I'll be there," he said. That was all. No estimate of how long, no discussion of cost, no conditions attached to the promise. Just 4 words. He said them the way a person says something that is already decided. Linda lowered the phone. The call had lasted 2 minutes. "He's coming," she said. Pete looked at the empty highway stretching out in both directions. The heat was sitting on everything. One of the bikes ticked as its engine cooled. A hawk was circling something in the field to the east, very high up, barely moving. "How long?" Gary asked. "Didn't say." Gary looked at the sky. "Fantastic." Nobody else said anything. They moved the bikes further off the road, got them stable on the gravel, and found whatever shade existed, which was almost none. Someone had water. Someone else had a bag of crackers from the diner. Pete sat on his bike with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, and he looked like a man who had waited in worse places for longer and was fine with it. Kenny stood at the edge of the shoulder and stared down the road in the direction they'd come from. He did this for a while, not watching for the truck exactly, just looking. The way you look when something is out of your hands and you've accepted it. They had been riding together for 11 years, this group. They'd started with 8 people and grown to 12. They had lost 2 members in that time, one to a stroke and one to something nobody liked to name directly, and they had ridden to both funerals and sat with both families and then kept riding, because that was what you did. 11 years of back roads and bad weather and good diners and arguments about routes, and the kind of closeness that only happens when people share small, uncomfortable spaces over a long stretch of time. They were not strangers to hard days. This was not a hard day in any real sense. Nobody was hurt. The bikes were fixable. The sun was bright and the company was the same company they always had. This was just stuck. But stuck in August, on a highway with no shade, 43 miles from help, with bikes that needed more work than any of them could do on the shoulder with what they had in their bags, was its own particular kind of uncomfortable. An hour passed, then another. The conversations that had been going in bursts went quiet. Pete was still on his bike. Gary had sat down on the gravel with his back against his rear tire and fallen most of the way asleep. Linda was walking slow circles on the shoulder, not looking at her phone, just moving. It was Kenny who saw the truck first. It was a dark green pickup, old enough to have earned its dents, pulling a single-axle trailer loaded with a chest toolbox, a few crates, and things covered in a blue tarp strapped down with orange cord. The truck moved at a steady speed, not rushing, just coming in the unhurried way the voice on the phone had sounded. It slowed and pulled to the shoulder ahead of them, the trailer following in a wide curve. The door opened. The man who stepped out was not young and not old. He was somewhere in the middle of his 60s, medium height, with the kind of build that came from work rather than a gym, thick through the shoulders and arms. He wore a gray shirt with no logo on it. His boots were the kind of boots that had been resoled at least once. He had a face that had been outside in all seasons, lined around the eyes, easy in its expression. Not smiling exactly, but not unfriendly either. He looked at the group. He looked at the bikes. He pulled a pair of glasses from his shirt pocket, put them on, and walked toward Eddie's bike without saying much at all. "This the belt that went," he said. "Yes," Eddie said. He crouched down and looked, took the glasses off, looked again. "What else?" They told him, all of it. He listened without writing anything down, just nodding at intervals, walking from bike to bike, crouching, looking, standing, moving on. When he was done, he went back to his truck and started pulling things off the trailer. His name, they would learn, was Roy Deacon. He had been running Darby's for 14 years, having bought it from an older man named Darby who had retired to Florida and sent a Christmas card every year. Roy had been a mechanic since he was 16. He had never done anything else, and he had never wanted to. He set up in the gravel shoulder of that highway and got to work, and the group stood back and watched a man do something he was very good at in a place where no one had asked him to come, and where there was no audience and no credit to be taken. The afternoon moved around them. The light changed. A few cars passed and slowed to look and kept going. Roy did not look up when cars passed. He was somewhere else entirely. He was in the work. And somewhere around the 4th hour, when the shadow of Eddie's bike had moved 3 feet to the east, and Gary had woken from his gravel nap, and Linda had drunk the last of the water, something shifted in the air on that highway shoulder. Nobody said what it was. Nobody needed to. It was the feeling of watching someone give something freely, without performance, without expectation, without any of the usual conditions that surround that kind of generosity. It was a simple thing, so simple it almost sneaked past them. But it didn't. Every one of them felt it, and none of them forgot it. Roy Deacon had not planned on this being how his Saturday went. He had planned on a short morning. 3 bikes already in the shop needed attention, all of them straightforward jobs he could move through without much trouble. A carburetor rebuild on a cruiser whose owner, a retired schoolteacher named Frank, came in every spring and every fall without fail, never missed. A tire swap on a sport bike that a young man named Colin had dropped off with barely a glance, too busy looking at his phone to notice Roy's shop, had been there since before Colin was born. And an oil change on a big touring bike belonging to a woman named Diane, who always brought him a container of homemade soup, which she left on the counter without comment, because she had noticed 3 years ago that Roy sometimes forgot to eat lunch. 3 jobs. A short morning, maybe a few hours into the afternoon, and then he would have locked up and driven home and sat on his back porch with the kind of tiredness that comes from good work well finished. That was the plan. The call from Linda Colt changed the plan. Roy had listened to her describe the situation without interrupting. He had heard the careful way she laid out the details, not exaggerating, not minimizing, just naming what was broken and trusting him to know what that meant. He appreciated that. He had dealt with enough people over the years who either panicked into uselessness or tried to sound calmer than they were, and both made his job harder. She was neither. She was clear. He said he would come, because the alternative was not something he could land on comfortably. 12 people on a highway shoulder in August with multiple bikes down. A tow service would be expensive and slow, and would not necessarily solve the actual problems. A parts and labor call-out from some mobile service would take half the day to arrive and charge 3 times what the work was worth. He had a truck, he had a trailer, he had the parts that might matter or close enough to make do. He had no good reason not to go. He told Frank his bike would be a day later. Frank said that was fine, no rush, take your time. He texted Colin that the tire swap was pushed to Monday. Colin sent back a thumbs-up emoji without asking why. He wrote a note for Diane and left it on the counter with her soup container, which she could pick up when she stopped by. The note said, "Out on a call. Back later, soup is in the fridge, thank you." Then he loaded the truck and went. The drive out was 43 miles of highway, and then a few miles of memory, because Roy had driven this road enough times over the years to have opinions about it. There was a bend near mile marker 60, where the road dipped, and the light hit differently in the afternoon, and there was a spot further on where the tree line pulled back, and you could see a full mile of flat nothing in every direction. And on a clear day that view did something to a person that was hard to name, but was always worth looking at. He did not rush. There was nothing he could do for them faster by rushing that he could not do better by arriving steady. When he pulled onto the shoulder and saw them, he made a quick count. 12 bikes, 12 people. They looked like a group that had been there a while and had settled into the kind of patience that comes after the initial frustration wears off. Some sitting, some standing. One man asleep against a rear tire. He noted that. He got out and did what he always did. He went to the bikes. People were secondary, not because they didn't matter, but because the bikes were why he was there. And the fastest way to help people was to deal with what was broken rather than standing around discussing it. He had learned this early, and it had served him well. The belt on the first bike was a clean snap. He had a compatible belt in the crate on his trailer, not exact, but close enough in width and length that with the right tension adjustment it would hold. He had done the same fix 4 or 5 times over the years, always in inconvenient places, always with a slightly wrong part that could be made right with patience and knowledge. He pulled the belt from the crate and got down in the gravel. The man whose bike it was, Eddie, stood nearby without hovering. Roy appreciated that too. The second and third bikes with rough engines turned out to share the same problem, a fuel delivery issue that had started, Roy suspected, when someone added a fuel additive at the last stop that had not agreed with the carburetors on these particular models. It was a fixable thing. It required cleaning and adjustment and a short road test, which Roy handled by riding each bike 20 yards up the shoulder and back while 12 people watched. He had been riding since he was 14. He rode every bike differently, adjusting almost without thinking to the weight and geometry and personality of each machine. Every bike had a personality. That was not a poetic statement. It was a mechanical one. The way weight was distributed, where the power came in, how the suspension absorbed the road, all of it added up to something that was specific and individual. Roy had learned to read that in the first 30 seconds of a ride. Both bikes ran clean after his work. The tire on Gary Sutton's bike needed more than Gary had let on, which was common. People knew when something was wrong but tended to describe it in its most optimistic form, hoping the optimistic form was the real one. The tire was not dangerously bad, but it was not fine either, and Roy swapped it with a spare he had on the trailer that was close in size and would do the job until Gary could get a proper replacement fitted at a real shop. He told Gary this plainly. "This gets you home," he said. "Don't push it past that." Gary nodded, understood. The clutch cable on Lynn Hargrove's bike was the most delicate piece of work. Roy did not have the exact cable. He had one that was close, and he had the tools and the knowledge to adapt it, but it required more time and more care than the other jobs, and he was aware that the light was changing and the afternoon was moving, and 12 people on a highway shoulder wanted to be somewhere else. He did not rush the cable. He had learned a long time ago that the only thing worse than a slow repair was a fast one that failed 40 miles down the road. Speed was not a virtue in this work. Accuracy was. He took the time the cable needed, and when he was done, he tested it 3 times before he told Lynn it was good. "How's it feel?" he said. Lynn squeezed the lever, released it, squeezed again. "Good," she said. "That feels right." "It's a close fit, not exact," he said. "You'll want it replaced properly at a shop, but it'll hold." She nodded. She was looking at her bike the way people look at something they've been worried about and have just been given reason to stop worrying about. Roy recognized that look. He had seen it 1,000 times and it never got old. While he worked, the group did what groups do in the absence of crisis once the crisis begins to resolve. They talked. Roy could hear the conversations moving around him at the edges of his attention without pulling him into them. Names were dropped, stories traded, laughter in short bursts. Someone had found more water in a bag they had forgotten about. Someone else had a bag of peanuts that got passed around. Kenny Briggs came and sat on a cooler near Roy's trailer. While Roy was reorganizing his tools between the clutch cable job and the last small adjustment he needed to make. "You drive out here a lot?" Kenny asked, "for calls like this?" "When it makes sense," Roy said. This made sense to you. Roy looked at him briefly. You were stuck, he said. As if that answered it, which to Roy it did. Kenny was quiet for a moment. Most shops wouldn't come. I know, Roy said, not dismissive, just acknowledging it. He did not elaborate, and Kenny did not press. But he sat there a while longer, watching Roy work, and there was something in the way Kenny watched that was not merely observation. It was the beginning of something else, some thought that was forming but not yet words. Roy would not know this for weeks. When the last bike was done, Roy walked the line of 12 machines one more time. He looked at each one the way a person looks at work they are about to release into the world, checking not just for what was fixed, but for anything missed, any detail that had been there all along and not declared itself until now. Everything held. He started packing his trailer. Pete Calloway came to him with money. Cash, folded, a real amount. The group had collected it in the time Roy was working, pooling what they had between them, arriving at a number that reflected what the work was worth, and then adding to it because they all felt the number should be larger than the market price. Roy counted the bills for the parts. He handed the rest back. Pete looked at the returned money. That's for your time, he said. Parts covered my time, Roy said. You drove 43 miles, Pete said. I know the road, Roy said. Pete stood there with the money in his hand, and Roy could see him working out what to say next, and Roy preempted it by turning back to his trailer and beginning to secure the tarps over the crates. Not rudely, just moving forward the way he always moved when a thing was finished and it was time for the next thing. Pete tried twice more. Roy declined both times without friction, without drama, without any of the false humility that sometimes accompanies refusal. He simply did not want the money he had not earned, and no amount of argument was going to change that arithmetic. He finished loading the trailer, checked the straps, walked around the truck once, and then turned to the group. You're all good, he said. Take it easy on the first 20 miles. Let everything settle. Thank you, Eddie said. He said it simply, directly, without ornamentation. Roy gave a short nod, got in the truck, pulled the door closed, eased out onto the highway. In his mirror he saw them standing on the shoulder, getting smaller. A few of them raised a hand. He drove. He thought about Diane's soup and whether it was still cold. He thought about Frank's carburetor and how he would get to it first thing Monday. He thought about the drive home, about the bend at mile 60 and the light that did something interesting there at this hour, almost gold, almost heavy, the way light gets in August when the day starts to let go. He was not thinking about gratitude. He was not thinking about what he had done. He was thinking about the road home, the same road he had always known, and about the quiet satisfaction of a day's work that had gone the way work was supposed to go. He did not think of himself as having done anything exceptional. That would remain true no matter what came next. But what came next was already beginning. On that shoulder, standing in the August heat watching a green truck disappear around a curve, 12 people were having the same thought at the same time. And none of them were going to let it go. The first conversation happened in the parking lot of a gas station 19 miles down the road, where they stopped to fill up and let the nerves of the afternoon settle into something calmer. Nobody planned it. Pete just said it, standing beside his bike with the fuel nozzle in his hand, not looking at anyone in particular. We can't just leave it at that, he said. Nobody asked what he meant. They all knew what he meant. That was how it started. The ride home that evening was quieter than usual, not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who were thinking. Roy Deacon had driven 43 miles on a Saturday afternoon to help people he had never met, had worked 5 hours in August heat on a gravel highway shoulder, had refused to take money for his time, and had left without wanting anything in return. That kind of thing sits with a person. It does not settle easily. It does not let itself be filed away and forgotten. By the time they reached the city that evening, the group chat was already active. It started with Linda, because Linda was the kind of person who moved from thought to action without a long pause between them. She sent a message that was short and direct. "What do we do for Roy?" The responses came in fast, overlapping the way group chats do when everyone has been thinking the same thing and just needed permission to say it out loud. Kenny said, "Something real, not just money." Gary said, "Money too, though." Pete said, "Agreed on both." Lynn said, "We need to know more about him first." That was the smartest thing anyone said that evening, and the group knew it immediately. Lynn had a way of doing that, of locating the practical step underneath the emotional impulse. You could not do something meaningful for a person you did not know. You could do something large. You could do something expensive, but meaningful required information. So they gathered information. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way most things in this group happened, through patient effort and divided labor, and the accumulation of small pieces that eventually made a full picture. Pete found Roy's shop listing and noted the address. He drove past it 3 days later on a Tuesday morning, not stopping, just looking. Darby's was on the edge of a commercial strip that had seen better decades, sandwiched between a hardware store and an empty building with a faded sign nobody had taken down. The shop itself was modest, a 2-bay building with a roll-up door on each bay, a gravel lot, a hand-painted sign above the door that said Darby's in letters that had been touched up at some point but were starting to need touching up again. There was a chalkboard propped near the door with the hours written in white chalk, not a printed sign, a chalkboard. Pete sat in his car across the street for a moment, just looking. He called Eddie when he got home. "He's got the lights on early," he said. "Looked like he was already working at 7:30. Eddie made a note of that. Gary Sutton, who had the loosest schedule of any of them having retired from the county roads department the previous spring, took it upon himself to become the group's informal researcher. He drove to the diner 2 blocks from Roy's shop, a place called Nell's that had been there since the 80s, and had the kind of regular clientele that knew everything about everyone in the surrounding 4 blocks. Gary ordered coffee and a slice of pie and let the conversation come to him, which with diner regulars did not take long. He mentioned he'd had a breakdown on the highway recently, and a mechanic named Roy had come out to help. The woman behind the counter, a woman in her late 50s named Carol who had been working at Nell's long enough that her name was on the staff photo from 15 years ago on the wall, looked up immediately. "Roy Deacon," she said. "That's the one," Gary said. Carol set the coffee pot down and leaned on the counter. "Roy's been coming in here for 12 years, she said. "Tuesdays and Fridays, always sits at the end of the counter, always orders the same thing. Black coffee and whatever the soup is." She paused. "He fixed my car once right here in this parking lot while I was on shift. Wouldn't let me pay him." Gary nodded. He was not surprised. He asked, in the careful way of someone who wants information without seeming to want it too badly, whether Roy had family nearby. Carol shook her head. "He's on his own," she said. "Wife passed, I think, about 8 years back. No kids that I know of, just the shop." Gary drank his coffee slowly and asked a few more questions, gentle ones, about the shop and how Roy ran it, about whether he had any help. "Just him," Carol said, "always just him. He had taken on an apprentice once, a young man named Kevin, and Kevin had worked there for 2 years and then moved to Georgia for a girl, which was the kind of thing that happened, and Roy had not replaced him. He seemed to prefer working alone." "He's not a lonely man, if that's what you're thinking," Carol said, reading something in Gary's face. "He's just self-contained. There's a difference." Gary agreed that there was. He paid for the coffee and the pie, left a good tip, and drove back across town to where Kenny Briggs was waiting for him in the parking lot of a sporting goods store, because they had already established they were not doing this over a phone call. They sat in Gary's truck, and Gary told Kenny everything Carol had told him. Kenny listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance. When Gary was done, Kenny said, "What does a one-man shop with no apprentice and a bad back actually need?" That question became the one they kept returning to over the following 2 weeks. They ruled out things quickly. A gift card felt like they were tipping him, which was exactly what he had refused. A dinner or party felt like they were making it about themselves and their gratitude rather than about him. A plaque or some kind of recognition felt even worse, too ceremonial, too much like they were asking him to stand in front of a group and be celebrated, which from everything they had learned was the last thing Roy Deacon would enjoy. They needed something that would make his actual daily life better. Something he would use every day. Something that would sit in his shop and do real work. Pete was the one who thought of the lift. He had been talking to a cousin who ran an auto shop, asking in a roundabout way about what kind of equipment made the most difference in a one-person operation, and the cousin had said without hesitation, a proper hydraulic lift. Takes the bending and crouching off a single mechanic, saves the back, makes everything faster and easier and safer. Pete had said, "What if a guy already had a lift?" The cousin had said, "What kind?" Pete had described what he'd seen through the roll-up door when he drove past Darby's. A floor jack, a few jack stands, nothing hydraulic. The cousin had said, "Then he doesn't have a lift, he has a prayer." Pete came back to the group with this. The conversation about the lift lasted 3 days, not because anyone disagreed with the idea, but because they wanted to do it right. They wanted to make sure it was the right model, the right capacity, the right thing for the bikes Roy actually worked on most. They did not want to give him something he would have to accommodate around, something that looked generous but created problems. Gary went back to Nell's and sat at the end of the counter on a Tuesday afternoon and waited. Roy came in at noon. Gary had positioned himself 2 seats away and had a newspaper open in front of him that he was not reading. He watched Roy in the way you watch someone when you are genuinely trying to understand them, not intrusively, just paying attention. Roy sat down, said hello to Carol by name, ordered coffee and the soup without looking at the board. He had the manner of a man who was comfortable in his own company and did not need a phone or a distraction to fill the quiet. He ate slowly. He looked out the window occasionally. He did not appear to be waiting for anything. After about 15 minutes, Carol said something to Roy about a water heater she was having trouble with, and Roy asked a question or two, and then told her what it probably was and how to check it and what part would need replacing. He said it the way he said everything, without fuss, without making it into a favor, just information transferred because it was needed. Gary looked at his newspaper and listened. When Roy left, Gary sat there a moment with his soup. He understood now, in a way he had not fully understood before, why this felt important to the group. Roy Deacon was not a dramatic person. He was not the kind of person stories usually got told about. He was the kind of person who fixed what was broken and went home and came back the next day and did it again. He was the kind of person who drove 43 miles without requiring a reason beyond the fact that someone needed him to. That kind of person was not rare because the world lacked them. It was rare because the world did not always notice them. Gary paid his check, left a tip, and walked out to his truck. He called Pete. "Get the lift," he said. The group pooled money over the following week. 12 people, some of them retired, some still working, all of them with different financial situations, and not one of them complained or offered less than they could give. The total came together faster than anyone expected. It was enough for the lift and then some, enough for a good one, a professional-grade hydraulic platform lift, the kind that would take weight off Roy's back for the next decade of work. Eddie, who had been in sales before he retired, researched models. He made calls. He found a supplier in the city who could deliver and install it in a shop the following week. Pete spoke to the supplier and arranged the specifics. He did not say who Roy was or explain the story. He just gave the address and the date and confirmed the delivery window. Then came the question of how to do it. They did not want to just have it delivered without Roy knowing. That felt incomplete. They had all driven past this man working alone on a highway shoulder and felt something, and that something deserved to be spoken, even briefly, even just once. They wanted to be there. But they also did not want to make it a spectacle. They did not want Roy to feel ambushed or put on display or obligated to perform gratitude in front of an audience. Linda was the one who found the balance. "We ride in," she said, "all of us. We tell him why we're there, we let the truck arrive. We don't make speeches, we don't ask him to stand in front of us and say anything. We just show up the same way he showed up for us." There was a silence on the call. Then Pete said, "That's it." The date was set. The delivery was confirmed. 12 riders marked the morning on their calendars. Roy Deacon did not know any of this. He was in his shop on a Tuesday afternoon, working on Frank's carburetor, with a cup of coffee going cold on the bench beside him, and the chalkboard by the door showing his hours in the same hand he had been writing them in for 14 years. He had no idea what was coming. And in 3 weeks, it would leave him without a single word. The morning of the day, everything changed for Roy Deacon, started the way every other morning started. He was awake at 5:30 without an alarm, which had been his habit for as long as he could remember, some internal clock that had been set years ago and never adjusted. He made coffee in the same pot he had used for 6 years, a stainless 12-cup that had a dent in the side from when he had knocked it off the counter once, and had not replaced it because it still worked perfectly. He drank the first cup standing at his kitchen window, looking out at the backyard, which at 5:30 in the morning was still dark enough to be almost nothing, just the shapes of the fence and the one large oak he had never gotten around to trimming. He was not a man who spent much time thinking about the past in the mornings. Mornings were for the day ahead. He ran through what was in the shop, Frank's carburetor, which he had finished on Monday and which was ready for pickup. A vintage restoration job for a man named Albert that was going slowly, not because the work was difficult but because Albert kept coming in with new ideas and Roy had learned to factor that in. A new drop-off from a woman named Cora whose brake lines needed a proper inspection, something she had been told at a dealership, and had come to Roy for a second opinion, which he would give her honestly whatever that opinion turned out to be. A full day, a normal day. He drove to the shop the same way he always did, taking the longer route along the road that passed the feed store and the elementary school, not because it was faster, but because the other road had a light that he found irritating, and after 14 years of having the choice, he simply chose not to sit at it. He unlocked the shop at 6:50, rolled up the bay doors, turned on the lights, and put on the coffee that he kept at the shop in a separate pot, also dented. He picked up Frank's carburetor to confirm his work one more time before Frank came for it. He had done this his whole career. The final check after the work was already finished and confirmed, not because he doubted himself, but because the habit had started early and had saved him twice, and he saw no reason to stop. It was good, he set it down. He was 3 minutes into Albert's restoration when he heard the engines. He heard them before he saw them. That particular sound, a group of motorcycles approaching together, was impossible to mistake for anything else. Not a single engine, not two, but a layered sound, multiple bikes in a loose formation, the combined note of them shifting as they slowed. He did not go to the door right away. He finished the adjustment he was in the middle of, set down the tool, wiped his hands on the rag he kept tucked through his belt loop, and then walked to the bay door. They were pulling into the gravel lot. All 12 of them. He stood at the bay door and watched them come in. They were in the same jackets they had been wearing on that highway shoulder 6 weeks ago. He recognized the bikes as they settled, the posture of the riders, Eddie on the first bike, Kenny behind him, The woman with 2 bars of cell signal, Linda, pulling in beside Kenny. One by one, until all 12 were in the lot and the engines went quiet. The silence after a group of engines shuts off has a particular quality. It is not ordinary quiet. It is the absence of something that was very present a moment before, and it makes everything feel more still than it actually is. Roy stood at the bay door. Eddie came toward him. He was not rushing. He walked the way a person walks when they have thought about this moment and they want it to happen at the right speed. "Roy," he said. "Eddie," Roy said. They shook hands. Roy looked at the group behind Eddie, all of them standing beside their bikes, nobody talking. "What's this?" Roy said. Eddie told him. He said they had thought about it for weeks, all of them. He said they had asked around, careful to not be too obvious about it but not always succeeding. He said they had talked to Carol at Nell's, which Roy's face registered with a small expression that might have been amusement, and that they had learned about the lift. "The lift," Roy said. Eddie told him what they had done, the collection among the 12 of them, the research, the model they had chosen and why, the delivery truck that was, at that moment, approximately 8 minutes away. Roy looked at him. Then he looked at the group. 12 people in matching jackets in his gravel lot, standing beside bikes that he had fixed on a highway shoulder in August, looking at him with the kind of expression people have when they are trying very hard not to make a moment bigger than it should be while also feeling that it is very large indeed. He started to say something. He stopped. He tried again. He did not manage it. His jaw moved. He looked away down the lot, out at the road beyond the gravel. He put his hand against the door frame of the bay, not leaning on it exactly, just touching it, the way a person touches something solid when they need to know it is there. He had spent 14 years in the shop. He had come in at 6:50 in the morning and worked until the work was done and gone home and come back and done it again. He had helped people because people needed help, and he had the knowledge and the tools and the time to provide it. He had not been keeping a tally. He had not been waiting for acknowledgement. It had not occurred to him to wonder whether anyone noticed, because whether they noticed had not been relevant to why he did it. He thought about the drive out to mile marker 71 on that August afternoon. He thought about crouching in the gravel with the belt and the clutch cable and the rough engines, the heat on the back of his neck, the shadow of the bikes moving on the ground as the afternoon went on. He thought about the drive home, the gold light at the bend near mile 60, thinking about soup. He had thought of it as a normal day, just a call that made sense, and so he went. He had not thought of it again, not with any weight, not as something that needed to be carried or processed or filed into a category. He fixed the bikes. He drove home. The next day he fixed other things. He had not known 12 people were carrying it differently. Kenny Briggs came forward. Kenny was not a small man and not a soft one, and he put his hand on Roy's shoulder the way men do when words are not the right tool, just a hand, present, solid. That was what did it. Roy pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. His eyes were wet. He was not fighting it exactly. He was not trying to stop it. He was just surprised by it, the way you are surprised by something that arrives before you expected it, even though you had all the information in front of you. He cried. Not a neat thing, not the kind of emotion that moves through a person gracefully and resolves, the kind that came from somewhere deep and had been there a long time, not grief, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The accumulation of years of doing things quietly and alone, of a shop he ran by himself, of Tuesdays and Fridays at Nell's with Carol and the soup and no particular need for anything more. He was not unhappy. That was important. He was not a man who wanted more than what he had. But something about 12 people standing in his gravel lot, having gone to all this trouble, having thought about him and asked about him, and found out what his back needed and gotten on their bikes to come and bring it to him. Something about that cut through a layer he had not known was there. It caught him by surprise. The delivery truck came 8 minutes later, exactly as Eddie had said it would, and turned into the lot with the careful wide arc of a large vehicle navigating a small space. The driver got out and looked at Roy and looked at the group. "Darby's," he said. "That's us," Linda said before Roy could speak. Roy pulled himself together. Not quickly and not with any performance of pulling himself together, but genuinely, the way a person returns to themselves after being briefly somewhere else. He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. He took a breath. He looked at the truck and the crated lift on the back of it. He looked at Eddie and at Kenny and at all 12 of them. He said, "You didn't have to do this." Pete, who had been quiet up to this point, said, "We know." Nobody added to that. Nobody needed to. Roy nodded once. He turned to the delivery driver. "Let's get it in." They all helped. All 12 of them in jackets, in a mechanic's gravel lot on a Tuesday morning, moving a hydraulic lift into a 2-bay shop that smelled like oil and metal and coffee, and all the years of work that had happened inside it. It was not elegant. It was not choreographed. Somebody tripped on a cable and caught themselves on a toolbox and said a word they then apologized for. Someone else kept handing Roy the wrong connector, and then finding the right one while Roy waited with the patience of a man who had spent 46 years waiting for people to hand him the right connector. The lift went in. Roy ran it once empty, just to confirm the mechanism. The platform rose smoothly and held. He put his hand on the edge of it and looked at it for a moment. Then he made coffee. He brought it out in paper cups, because he only had 4 real mugs and there were 12 people plus a delivery driver, and nobody complained and nobody pointed out that it was paper. Cora's brake line inspection could wait. Albert's restoration could wait. Everything in the shop could wait. They drank coffee in the bay, standing around a lift that was now a permanent fixture of this space, and the conversation was easy and unhurried in the way conversations are when the main thing has already been said, and what remains is just people being together. Roy talked more than he usually did, not much more but noticeably. He told them about a trip he had taken once, years back, across 3 states on a bike that had needed attention at every stop, and how he had learned more on that trip about what could go wrong with an engine than in any shop, because when it was your bike and your trip you paid attention differently. Pete laughed at something and Gary told a story about his own worst trip, and somehow that turned into a conversation about the diner 3 towns back where they had eaten the morning of the breakdown, and the argument about who had ordered the wrong thing, and whether cold coffee was actually a problem or whether cold coffee was a choice people made. Roy listened to all of this with a coffee cup in his hand, and a look on his face that was quiet and specific, and not quite like any of the looks he usually wore, because it was the look of a man who was in the middle of something unexpected and had decided to be present in it rather than move through it toward the next thing. He would move toward the next thing later. He always did. But right now he was here, in his shop, with 12 people who had ridden 60 miles on a Tuesday morning to give him something for his back. He had not asked for it. He had not expected it. He would never forget it. At some point, after the coffee was gone and the delivery driver had left, and the conversation had run its natural course, the group put on their helmets and got back on their bikes. One by one, the engine started, that layered sound again, filling the lot and then the street beyond it, and they filed out and turned onto the road and were gone. Roy stood at the bay door and watched them leave. He stood there until the sound was completely gone, which took longer than you might think. Then he went back to work. The story did not spread the way most stories spread. There was no video of the lift being installed. There was no photo of Roy's face in the moment that had undone him in the gravel lot. Nobody had pulled out a phone to capture it, not because anyone had agreed not to, but because it had simply not occurred to anyone in that moment to do anything other than be present in it. The only records were the ones inside 12 people who had been there. For 3 weeks the group kept it among themselves, not deliberately. They were not hiding it. It just did not feel like something that needed to be broadcast. It felt like something that had happened and was complete. Then Eddie wrote about it. He was not a writer in any formal sense. He had spent 22 years in sales and then retired and found that he had more time for thinking than he had ever had before. And sometimes the thinking turned into words that he put down, not for anyone in particular, just because putting them down made them more real and more clear. He had a small blog that his sister had helped him set up, and that his brother-in-law and 2 friends from his old job occasionally read. He wrote about the day on the highway. He wrote about watching Roy work in the heat for 5 hours. He wrote about Roy refusing the money with the same ease that other people refuse a second slice of cake, naturally, without struggle, because it was simply not something he wanted. He wrote about the planning that followed, about Gary at the diner, about Pete driving past the shop on a Tuesday morning, about Lynn pointing out that they needed to understand what Roy actually needed before they could do something meaningful for him. He wrote about the gravel lot, and the 12 bikes in it, and the lift in its crate on the truck bed. He wrote one sentence about what happened when Eddie told Roy why they were there, and the sentence was, "Roy Deacon cried in his own shop on a Tuesday morning, and nobody looked away, and nobody made it smaller than it was." He posted it on a Thursday evening, expecting his usual readers, expecting his brother-in-law to send a one-line response, expecting his friend Carol from the old job to leave a comment about how she needed more stories like this one. By Friday morning, 1,400 people had read it. By Sunday, the number was something that Eddie did not fully believe when he looked at the screen, enough people that the page had slowed when he tried to load it, enough that the comments were coming in faster than he could follow them. Each one a small note from a stranger who had read about Roy Deacon and felt something and needed to say so. Most of the comments were short. Things like, "This is what I needed today," and "There are still people like this in the world," and "I want to be the kind of person this mechanic is." Some were longer. Some told their own stories, their own Roy Deakins, the person who had shown up without reason and done what was needed, and disappeared back into their ordinary life without waiting for recognition. Every person who wrote a long comment seemed slightly surprised by how much they had to say, as if Eddie's story had unlocked something they had been holding for a while. One comment was from Carol at Nell's. She had somehow found the piece, whether through the group's social media or through some chain of shared links, and she wrote, "I know Roy. He's been coming in on Tuesdays and Fridays for 12 years, and he has never once let me overpay for anything, and I am not surprised by any of this." Roy did not see any of it for several days. He was not on the internet in any regular way. He had an email address that he checked every few days for parts orders and supplier updates. He did not have social media accounts. He did not search for his own name. The phone at the shop rang, and he answered it, and sometimes it was Frank asking about his carburetor, and sometimes it was a new customer, and occasionally it was somebody who had the wrong number, and he told them so without irritation. He found out about the story on a Wednesday when Frank came to pick up his bike. Frank was 72 and retired from teaching high school English for 35 years, and he was the kind of person who read everything, printed things he found interesting, and brought them places. He came in with the printed pages folded in his jacket pocket, and he put them on Roy's workbench while Roy went over the carburetor work. "You should read that," Frank said. Roy looked at the pages. He looked at Frank. "Later," he said. He read it that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with the same coffee pot that had the dent in the side. He read it once, quickly. Then he sat for a moment and read it again, more slowly. He had not known Eddie wrote. He had not known about the blog. He had not had any sense, in the week since the Tuesday morning with the lift, that the story had gone anywhere beyond the 12 people who had been present for it. He read the sentence about crying in his shop, and he sat with that for a while. He was not embarrassed by it. He had not been embarrassed at the time, which was perhaps the thing that had surprised him most about the moment itself. He had expected to be embarrassed, and he had not been. He had been caught off guard, and then he had been present in it, and there was a difference. He thought about the people who had read the story and commented. He thought about the ones who had shared their own stories, their own people who had shown up without reason. He thought about what that said about what people were carrying around, the quiet gratitude for ordinary goodness that rarely had anywhere to land. He did not know how to respond to any of it. He was not a person who gave interviews or made statements. He was not going to post anything or call anyone. He did one thing. He drove to Nell's the next Tuesday, and when Carol brought his coffee and his soup, he said, "I saw your comment." Carol looked at him. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were not. "Good," she said. Then she went to refill someone else's coffee, because that was what she did on Tuesdays, and Roy ate his soup, and the diner moved around him the way it always had, and that was all. But that was not quite the end of it. 3 weeks after Eddie's piece had circulated, a local paper ran a short feature. A journalist named Greg had read the piece online and had driven to the shop and knocked on the door and introduced himself to Roy, who had stood in the bay door in the same way he had stood there when 12 bikes pulled into his lot, with a rag over his shoulder and an expression that was measuring the situation without committing to it. Roy had agreed to 5 minutes. The 5 minutes became 30, not because Roy became expansive, but because Greg was a patient and careful interviewer who asked small questions and left room, and did not try to make Roy into something larger than he was. The piece Greg wrote was modest and accurate. It described the shop and the chalkboard hours and the lift that now stood in the center bay. It quoted Roy twice. Once, Roy said, "I went because they needed help and I had what they needed. That's the whole thing." And once, near the end, when Greg had asked Roy whether all the attention felt strange, Roy had looked at the lift for a moment and said, "It's a good piece of equipment." Greg understood that this was Roy's way of saying something larger. He put it at the end of the piece without explaining it, because some things do not need explaining. The lift was in the shop, and it was doing what it was built to do. Roy's back was better in the small, incremental way that the right equipment changes a person's daily experience over time, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, day after day, in a way that adds up. He still opened at 6:50. He still kept his hours on a chalkboard. The sign above the door still said Darby's in letters that needed touching up. On Tuesdays and Fridays he still went to Nell's and ordered the coffee and whatever the soup was, and Carol still brought it without his having to ask, the way she had been doing for 12 years. Occasionally new customers came in who had heard about him from Eddie's piece or from the newspaper feature, people who said they had read the story and wanted to bring their bike to him. Roy treated these customers the same way he treated every other customer. He looked at their bike. He told them what it needed. He charged them what it was worth. Some of them tried to tell him they admired what he had done on that highway. He listened politely and then got back to the bike, because the bike was why they were there, and the bike was what he could actually help with. The group rode again in the fall. They came through his town on a Saturday, all 12 of them, and stopped at the shop not because anything was broken but because they wanted to. Roy was in the bay when they arrived, and he came out and shook hands and talked for 20 minutes, longer than he usually would, because these were different people now, people he had a history with rather than strangers at a highway mile marker. Pete brought a thermos of coffee. Roy brought out the paper cups again, because he still only had 4 real mugs. They stood in the bay, in the warm smell of oil and metal and work, beside the lift that Roy had now used every working day for 3 months, and that had done exactly what it was supposed to do for his knees and his back in his mornings, and they drank the coffee and talked about nothing in particular. The way people talk when the important thing has already been said, and what remains is just the pleasure of being in the same place. The lift stood in the center of the bay like a fact, like something that had always been there, like something that belonged. Which was true now, it did belong. Roy had put a small mark on the base of it, a shallow scratch made with a scribe on the first morning he used it, the way he marked tools that were his, the habit of a man who had borrowed things and had things borrowed, and had learned that a mark kept everything clear. Nobody else would notice the mark. It was small and low down on the base. But Roy knew it was there. When Eddie's group got back on their bikes and pulled out of the lot that Saturday afternoon, Roy stood at the bay door and watched them go. He had done this before, watched their bikes disappear around the curve at the end of the road, and it felt the same as it had before, familiar in the way that things become familiar when they have happened more than once. He watched until the sound of them was gone. Then he went back to Albert's restoration, which was still going slowly because Albert still kept coming in with new ideas, and Roy had long since accepted this as one of the terms of the job. He picked up the tool he had set down when he heard the engines. He found his place in the work. Outside, the afternoon was settling into the particular quiet of a Saturday when the traffic has thinned, and the light is starting to go soft, the same light that moved at the bend near mile 60 when you took the highway out of town, the light that did something to a person that was hard to name but was always worth looking at. Roy did not look at it. He was already in the work. That was where he had always been, and where he would be tomorrow, and the day after that in the same shop, with the same coffee pot, with the hours in chalk on the board by the door, and the lift in the center bay, and all the bikes that would come through needing whatever they needed. He had not set out to be a story anyone told. He had just set out to be useful. It turned out those two things were not as different as they seemed.